The summer sun blazed down on the cobblestone streets of Windsor, as 12-year-old Tommy Mitchell bounced his worn soccer ball against the ancient castle walls. His mother had warned him countless times about playing near the royal grounds, but Tommy never listened to anyone. He was the kind of boy who thought rules were made for other people, not for him. Tommy lived with his grandmother in a small flat just outside the castle grounds. His parents had sent him there for the summer, hoping the change of scenery might improve his behavior. But Tommy had other plans. He spent his days exploring every corner of the historic town, always looking for trouble to get into. On this particular afternoon, Tommy noticed something different. More guards than usual patrolled the area, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone walls. Their tall black hats made them look like toy soldiers, and Tommy couldn't help but smirk. He had always found the royal guards amusing with their serious faces and fancy uniforms. As Tommy kicked his ball higher and harder against the wall, he noticed one guard watching him closely. The man stood perfectly still, his rifle at his side, his eyes following every movement. Tommy felt a surge of defiance rise in his chest. Who did this guard think he was, staring at him like that? The guard, Sergeant William Hayes, had been protecting the royal family for 15 years. He had seen all kinds of people try to test the boundaries around the castle grounds. Most were tourists who simply didn't know better. But this boy was different. There was something in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. Tommy decided to test how far he could push things. He kicked the ball directly at the guard's feet, watching as the man stepped aside without changing his expression. Then Tommy retrieved his ball and did it again. And again, each time the guard simply moved out of the way, maintaining his professional composure. Other tourists had gathered to watch the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Tommy saw his opportunity to show off. He had always been the class clown, the one who could make everyone laugh by being bold and outrageous. Today would be no different. As the ceremony began, Tommy positioned himself where he knew he would be visible to both the guards and the growing crowd of spectators. He had no idea that among those tourists were several important dignitaries and foreign visitors who had come specifically to witness the traditional British ceremony. The boy's grandmother, Mrs. Mitchell, was busy preparing dinner back at their flat, completely unaware of what her grandson was planning. She had trusted Tommy to behave himself for just a few hours while she ran errands and cooked. That trust was about to be severely tested. Tommy watched as the guards began their precise ceremonial movements. Every step was calculated, every turn executed with military precision. The tourists stood in respectful silence, cameras clicking softly as they captured the historic moment. But Tommy felt no respect for tradition or ceremony. He felt only the familiar urge to rebel against authority. The summer breeze carried the sound of military drums and the shuffle of polished boots across the courtyard. Tommy bounced on his toes, his heart racing with anticipation. He had decided exactly what he was going to do, and nothing could stop him now. Sergeant Hayes continued his duties, but his trained eye never left the boy. Something about Tommy's behavior set off alarm bells in the experienced guard's mind. In his years of service, he had developed an instinct for trouble, and this child was definitely trouble waiting to happen. The ceremony reached its most solemn moment, with guards standing at perfect attention while the Union Jack fluttered proudly overhead. The crowd held their breath, swept up in the majesty of a tradition that had continued for centuries. This was the moment Tommy had been waiting for. Without warning, Tommy stepped forward from the crowd, his young face twisted into a defiant grin. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. Tommy raised his right hand high in the air, his middle finger extended in a gesture that shocked the entire crowd into silence. The sacred ceremony came to an abrupt halt as gasps echoed through the courtyard. Cameras stopped clicking, children were quickly pulled closer to their parents, and the dignified atmosphere transformed into one of horror and disbelief. Sergeant Hayes felt his jaw tighten, but his military training kept him perfectly still. He had witnessed many disruptions during his career, but never had a child shown such blatant disrespect during a royal ceremony. The boy stood there with his offensive gesture held high, a satisfied smirk spreading across his young face as he soaked in the shocked reactions around him. The other guards maintained their positions, but their eyes communicated volumes. Years of discipline prevented them from breaking formation, even in the face of such unprecedented disrespect. The ceremony that had been passed down through generations, was being mocked by a 12-year-old boy who clearly had no understanding of the consequences of his actions. Tommy felt a rush of power as he saw the impact of his gesture. The crowd of well-dressed tourists looked horrified, some covering their children's eyes, others shaking their heads in disgust. This was exactly the reaction he had hoped for. He had successfully disrupted their precious ceremony and made himself the center of attention. What Tommy didn't know was that among the crowd stood Lord Hampton, a high-ranking member of the royal household, who was visiting to inspect the guard procedures. Lord Hampton had served the crown for over 30 years and had never witnessed such a deliberate act of disrespect on royal grounds. His face turned red with anger as he watched the scene unfold. Also present was Mrs. Catherine Wells, the headmistress of the most prestigious boarding school in England. She had brought a group of international students to witness what she called the finest example of British tradition and respect. Now she watched, in horror, as a child destroyed the very lesson she had hoped to teach. Tommy kept his gesture raised for what felt like an eternity but was actually only about 10 seconds. Those 10 seconds, however, were enough to change everything. Several tourists had managed to capture the moment on their cameras, and Tommy had no idea how far those images would travel or what consequences they would bring. Finally, Tommy lowered his hand, still grinning with satisfaction. He expected the guards to continue standing there helplessly while he walked away triumphant. He expected the crowd to eventually forget about the incident and move on with their day. He expected to return to his grandmother's flat with a funny story to tell, but Tommy had seriously underestimated the situation he had created. Sergeant Hayes stepped forward, breaking from his ceremonial position for the first time in his 15-year career. His movement was swift and decisive, causing the crowd to step back instinctively. The other guards immediately adjusted their positions, creating a clear path between the sergeant and the defiant boy. Tommy's confident smirk began to fade as he realized that the guard was actually moving toward him. This wasn't part of his plan. In his mind, the guards were like the toy soldiers he had at home, impressive to look at but ultimately harmless. The reality of facing a real military professional was beginning to sink in. The crowd watched in tense silence as Sergeant Hayes approached Tommy with measured steps. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes burned with controlled anger. Every person in the courtyard could feel the shift in atmosphere. This was no longer a disrupted ceremony. This was about to become a serious confrontation. Tommy tried to maintain his defiant attitude, but his hands began to shake slightly. He had never been in trouble with real authority figures before. His teachers at school were annoying and his parents were strict, but this was different. This man represented something much more serious and powerful than anything Tommy had ever encountered. Lord Hampton moved closer to get a better view of how the situation would be handled. Mrs. Wells gathered her students together, torn between wanting to protect them from witnessing what might happen next and recognizing that this could be an important lesson about actions and consequences. As Sergeant Hayes drew nearer, Tommy finally began to understand that his little prank had triggered something much bigger than he had intended. The weight of tradition, respect, and authority that he had so carelessly mocked was now bearing down on him with full force. The boy who had felt so powerful just moments before now felt very small and very alone in the middle of the silent courtyard. Sergeant Hayes stopped directly in front of Tommy, towering over the boy like a mountain of authority and discipline. Up close, Tommy could see every detail of the guard's uniform, the perfectly polished buttons, the razor-sharp creases in the fabric, and the military decorations that spoke of years of dedicated service. The man's presence was overwhelming, and Tommy felt his earlier confidence crumble completely. "Young man," Sergeant Hayes spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Do you understand what you have just done?" His words cut through the silence like a blade, and Tommy found himself unable to respond. The simple question seemed loaded with implications that the boy was only beginning to grasp. Tommy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He wanted to maintain his rebellious attitude, to show that he wasn't afraid of some guy in a fancy uniform, but the words wouldn't come. Standing face to face with Sergeant Hayes, Tommy realized that this wasn't just some guy. This was a professional soldier who had dedicated his life to serving something much bigger than himself. The crowd remained completely silent, creating an atmosphere so tense that even the usual sounds of the city seemed muted. Parents held their children closer, tourists lowered their cameras, and everyone waited to see how this confrontation would unfold. Some visitors began to whisper among themselves, wondering if they should leave, but most were too captivated by the drama to move. You have insulted not just me, but the crown, the country, and every person who has ever worn this uniform, Sergeant Hayes continued, his voice never rising, but somehow becoming more powerful with each word. You have shown disrespect to traditions that men and women have died protecting. Do you comprehend the gravity of what you've done? Tommy tried to find his voice, but all that came out was a barely audible, I was just... He couldn't finish the sentence because he was beginning to realize that there was no excuse that would make this better. What had seemed like harmless fun just minutes before now felt like a terrible mistake. Lord Hampton stepped forward from the crowd, his expensive suit and bearing immediately marking him as someone of importance. Sergeant Hayes, he said in a crisp, authoritative voice, I believe this situation requires more than just words. Tommy looked between the two men, his heart racing as he realized that even more authority figures were getting involved. Mrs. Wells also approached, her face stern with disapproval. As an educator, she said, I can tell you that this child's behavior represents a complete failure of proper upbringing. Such disrespect cannot be tolerated or overlooked. Her words stung Tommy more than he expected, and he felt his cheeks burn with shame. Tommy looked around desperately, hoping to see a friendly face or find some escape route, but he was surrounded by disapproving adults and the exit seemed impossibly far away. The other guards had subtly repositioned themselves to block any potential escape routes, though Tommy was too panicked to notice their tactical movement. What's your name, boy? Sergeant Hayes demanded, and Tommy found himself answering automatically, Tommy Mitchell. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and he immediately wished he had stayed silent. Giving his real name made everything feel more serious, more permanent. And where do you live, Tommy Mitchell? The sergeant continued his interrogation. Tommy's mind raced, but he couldn't think of any reason not to answer. With my grandmother, Mrs. Mitchell, on Abbey Road, he replied, his voice getting smaller with each word. Sergeant Hayes nodded grimly. Mrs. Mitchell needs to know what her grandson has done today. She needs to understand that she is responsible for a child who thinks it's acceptable to mock the crown on royal grounds. The thought of his grandmother finding out filled Tommy with a new kind of dread. That was even worse than facing the guards. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some expressing sympathy for the boy while others called for stricter consequences. Tommy could hear fragments of their conversations, words like disgraceful, punishment, and example, that made his stomach turn with anxiety. Please, Tommy finally managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. But even as he said the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. The damage was done, and everyone could see that his joke had real consequences for real people. Sergeant Hayes studied the boy's face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What he saw was a frightened child who was beginning to realize that actions have consequences, but who still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done. The sergeant knew that this moment would be crucial in determining what kind of person this boy would become. Sergeant Hayes made a decision that would change Tommy's life forever. Instead of simply scolding the boy and sending him away, he chose to make this a teaching moment that Tommy would never forget. Lord Hampton, he said, turning to the distinguished gentleman, I request permission to escort this young man through a proper education about respect and consequence. Lord Hampton nodded approvingly. Granted, Sergeant. I believe some immediate corrective action is necessary. His words carried the weight of royal authority, and Tommy felt his knees go weak as he realized that powerful people were now personally involved in his punishment. Tommy Mitchell, Sergeant Hayes announced in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard, you will remain here until you understand the true meaning of the respect you have chosen to mock. The formal tone made Tommy's offense seem even more serious, and he felt the eyes of every person in the crowd burning into him. 2 additional guards approached and positioned themselves on either side of Tommy. They didn't touch him or threaten him, but their presence made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere until this situation was resolved. Tommy had gone from being a carefree troublemaker to being essentially under military custody in the span of just a few minutes. First, Sergeant Hayes continued. You will stand at attention for the next hour just as we do, and learn what it means to maintain discipline and show respect. Tommy looked around desperately, but there was no sympathy in any of the faces staring back at him. Even some of the children in the crowd looked at him with disapproval rather than understanding. Mrs. Wells approached Tommy directly. Young man, she said in the stern voice she usually reserved for her most troublesome students, I want you to understand that your behavior today has embarrassed not just yourself, but your entire generation. You have shown the world that some children today have no respect for tradition or authority. Tommy tried to protest, but Sergeant Hayes cut him off with a sharp gesture. You will not speak unless given permission, he commanded. Part of learning respect is learning when to listen and when to remain silent. This was completely foreign territory for Tommy, who was used to always having something to say and never being afraid to say it. The crowd, rather than dispersing as Tommy had hoped, seemed to be growing larger. Word was spreading through the area that something dramatic was happening at the castle, and more tourists and locals were arriving to witness the spectacle. Tommy realized with growing horror that his moment of rebellion was becoming a public humiliation. One of the tourist families included a man who recognized the educational value of what was happening. He quietly explained to his teenage sons, Boys, watch this carefully. This is what happens when someone shows disrespect to institutions that deserve honor. That young man is learning a lesson that will stay with him for the rest of his life. Sergeant Hayes began Tommy's education by explaining the history and significance of the Royal Guard. These uniforms, he said, gesturing to his own and those of his fellow guards, represent hundreds of years of service and sacrifice. Men wearing these uniforms have died protecting the values and traditions of this nation. When you mock us, you mock their memory and their sacrifice. Tommy found himself forced to listen as the sergeant continued. Every ceremony you interrupted today has been performed for generations. It connects us to our history, to our identity as a people, and to something greater than ourselves. You thought it was funny to disrupt that connection, but you succeeded only in revealing your own ignorance and disrespect. The hour of standing at attention began, and Tommy quickly discovered that maintaining perfect posture was much more difficult than it looked. His back started to ache within the first 10 minutes, his legs began to tremble with fatigue, and his arms felt heavy at his sides. The guards, meanwhile, stood perfectly still as if they could maintain their positions forever. As Tommy struggled with the physical demands of standing at attention, he also had to endure the psychological pressure of being watched by dozens of strangers. Some tourists took pictures, some shook their heads in disapproval, and some made comments loud enough for him to hear. Every minute felt like an hour, and Tommy began to understand that this punishment was designed to be as mentally challenging as it was physical. Mrs. Wells continued to observe the situation, taking notes in a small notebook. She was documenting everything she saw, planning to use this incident as a case study in her educational seminars about discipline and consequences. Tommy had become an unwitting example of what happens when children are not taught proper respect for authority and tradition. Halfway through the hour, Tommy's legs began to shake uncontrollably, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool breeze. He wanted desperately to sit down, to rest, to escape from the public humiliation, but the guards on either side of him made it clear that movement was not permitted. The lesson was working exactly as Sergeant Hayes had intended. Tommy was beginning to understand that discipline and respect weren't just abstract concepts. They were real skills that required real effort and real sacrifice. As the hour dragged on, Tommy's defiant attitude completely crumbled under the weight of physical exhaustion and public shame. His legs trembled so badly that he feared he might collapse, but the thought of falling down in front of all these people motivated him to keep standing. Sweat stung his eyes. His mouth was dry as dust and every muscle in his body screamed for relief. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional realization that was slowly dawning on him. As he stood there, forced to maintain the same disciplined posture that the guards maintained every day, Tommy began to understand the dedication and sacrifice that their job required. These men weren't just wearing costumes for tourists. They were professionals who had earned their positions through years of training and commitment. Sergeant Hayes occasionally moved closer to correct Tommy's posture. Shoulders back, he would say quietly, or keep your chin up. Each correction was delivered without malice, but with the firm expectation that it would be followed immediately. Tommy found himself automatically obeying, his body learning to respond to authority even when his mind still wanted to rebel. The crowd around them had evolved throughout the hour. Some of the original spectators had left, but new people had arrived, drawn by curiosity about the unusual scene. Parents used Tommy as a teaching moment for their own children, pointing out what happened when someone chose to be disrespectful. Tommy could hear their whispered conversations and felt the weight of becoming a cautionary tale. One elderly gentleman in the crowd approached Sergeant Hayes during a brief moment, when the sergeant stepped aside. "Excuse me," the man said in a voice cultured by decades of education and refinement. "I wanted to tell you that what you're doing here is exactly right. That boy needed to learn this lesson, and you're teaching it in a way he'll never forget." The man turned out to be Professor James Whitmore, a retired history teacher who had spent 40 years educating young people about the importance of respect and tradition. "I've seen too many children who think they can do whatever they want without consequences," he told Sergeant Hayes. "This boy is lucky to learn this lesson now, while he's still young enough to change." Tommy overheard this conversation and felt a new wave of shame wash over him. Even strangers could see that he needed to learn respect and discipline. The realization that adults he didn't even know were discussing his character flaws was almost more humiliating than the physical punishment. As the hour finally neared its end, Tommy was exhausted, embarrassed, and beginning to feel something he had never experienced before: genuine remorse. Not just regret that he had been caught, but actual sorrow for the disrespect he had shown to people who deserved better from him. Sergeant Hayes announced that the hour was complete, and Tommy nearly collapsed with relief. But his ordeal was far from over. "Now," the sergeant said, "you will personally apologize to every guard whose ceremony you disrupted, and you will do so in front of all these witnesses." Tommy's heart sank as he realized that his public humiliation was entering a new phase. But as he looked at the faces of the guards he had mocked, he saw something that surprised him. There was no hatred or anger in their expressions. Instead, he saw the faces of men who took their duty seriously and who hoped that he had learned something valuable from this experience. The first guard Tommy approached was a young man named Private Johnson, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "I'm sorry," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for making fun of your ceremony and for being disrespectful." Private Johnson nodded solemnly and said, "Apology accepted. I hope you understand now that what we do here matters to a lot of people." One by one, Tommy made his way to each guard, offering his apologies and receiving their acceptance with dignity and grace that surprised him. These men, whom he had seen as targets for his pranks, were showing him more kindness and understanding than he probably deserved. Lord Hampton watched the entire apology process with approval. When Tommy finished, the distinguished gentleman stepped forward. "Young man," he said, "you have taken the first step toward becoming a person worthy of respect. But this is only the beginning. The real test will be whether you remember this lesson when you're faced with future choices about how to treat others." Mrs. Wells also approached Tommy, her expression slightly softer than it had been earlier. "I hope you understand now that respect isn't just about following rules," she told him. "It's about recognizing the value and dignity of other people and the institutions that serve important purposes in our society." As Tommy stood there, surrounded by the adults who had witnessed his transformation, he felt something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt truly accountable for his actions and genuinely motivated to become a better person. But Tommy's education wasn't finished yet. Sergeant Hayes had one final lesson planned, and this one would be the most powerful of all. "Tommy," he said, "I want you to understand something important about the men and women who serve in uniforms like mine. I'm going to tell you about my son." The sergeant's voice took on a different quality as he began to speak about something deeply personal. "My son Michael was 19 years old when he died serving his country in Afghanistan. He wore a uniform just like this one, and he believed in everything it represented: honor, duty, sacrifice, and service to something greater than himself." Tommy felt his stomach drop as he realized where this conversation was heading. The guard he had mocked wasn't just a ceremonial figure. He was a father who had lost his child in service to the same values that Tommy had treated as a joke. "Michael used to stand guard just like I do," Sergeant Hayes continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion that was impossible to miss. He understood that wearing the uniform meant accepting responsibility for protecting others, even when those others might not appreciate or understand that protection. The crowd around them had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what they were hearing. Tommy stood frozen, understanding for the first time that his actions had real impact on real people with real stories and real pain. "When you raised your finger at me today," Sergeant Hayes said, looking directly into Tommy's eyes, "you weren't just insulting me. You were insulting every person who has ever worn this uniform, including my son who gave his life for the values you decided to mock." Tommy felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He had never thought about the real people behind the uniforms, the families who worried about their loved ones, the sacrifices that were made every day by people he had never bothered to consider as actual human beings. "I'm so sorry," Tommy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know. I didn't think about any of that. I thought it was funny." The words sounded hollow and childish even to his own ears, and he realized how inadequate any apology would be for what he had done. Sergeant Hayes studied Tommy's face carefully, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than just fear or embarrassment. What he saw gave him hope. The boy's tears were real, and his remorse seemed to come from a deeper place than just regret at being caught. "The good news, Tommy," the sergeant said, his voice becoming slightly warmer, "is that you're young enough to learn from this mistake and become the kind of person who honors, rather than mocks, the sacrifices others have made. The question is whether you'll choose to do that, or whether you'll go back to thinking that disrespect is entertaining." Lord Hampton stepped forward again, having observed the entire interaction with great interest. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "I believe this young man has learned something today that will benefit him for the rest of his life. But I also believe that learning should come with opportunity to make amends." Tommy looked up hopefully, wondering if there might be a way to somehow make up for what he had done. Lord Hampton continued, "I propose that Tommy spend the next week volunteering here at the castle, learning about the history and traditions he mocked today. Perhaps understanding will breed the respect that was missing before." Mrs. Wells nodded in agreement. "An excellent idea. True education comes not just from punishment, but from understanding. If Tommy can learn about the people and values behind these ceremonies, he might become an advocate for respect, rather than an example of disrespect." Tommy found himself nodding eagerly. The prospect of spending a week learning about the guards and their traditions seemed like both a punishment and an opportunity. For the first time that day, he felt like he might be able to do something positive to balance out the negative impact of his actions. Sergeant Hayes considered the proposal carefully. "Tommy," he said, "if you accept this opportunity, you'll be expected to arrive here every morning at 6 o'clock. You'll work alongside the guards, learn about our history, and help with various duties around the grounds. It won't be easy, and it won't be fun in the way that disrupting ceremonies might seem fun. Are you willing to commit to that?" Tommy looked around at all the faces watching him, the disappointed tourists, the stern adults, the professional guards who had shown him more patience than he deserved. He thought about Sergeant Hayes' son Michael, about the sacrifices he had never considered, about the person he wanted to become versus the person he had been that morning. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice stronger and more confident than it had been all day. "I want to learn, I want to understand, and I want to make up for what I did today." For the first time since the confrontation began, Sergeant Hayes allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps this impudent child who had shown such disrespect could indeed be transformed into a young man who understood the value of honor and service. The week that followed transformed Tommy Mitchell in ways he never could have imagined. Every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, he reported to Sergeant Hayes at the castle gates, ready to begin another day of learning and service. The early hours were brutal for a boy accustomed to sleeping until noon during summer vacation, but Tommy never complained or asked to quit. On his first day, Sergeant Hayes introduced Tommy to the real work behind the ceremonial duties. Tommy learned that the guards spent hours each day polishing their boots, pressing their uniforms, and maintaining their equipment to the exacting standards required for royal service. What looked effortless during ceremonies was actually the result of meticulous preparation and unwavering dedication. Tommy also met the families of the guards, including Mrs. Hayes, who invited him to dinner on the third day of his volunteer service. Over a simple meal, she showed Tommy photographs of her son, Michael, and told stories about his childhood dreams of serving his country. Tommy listened with tears in his eyes, finally understanding that the uniform represented real people with real families who made real sacrifices. By the fourth day, Tommy had earned enough trust to help with small tasks during the changing of the guard ceremony. He polished brass fittings, organized equipment, and even helped guide tourists to appropriate viewing areas. The same tourists, who had witnessed his shameful behavior earlier in the week, now saw him working respectfully alongside the guards he had once mocked. Mrs. Wells, who had remained in contact with Lord Hampton throughout the week, observed Tommy's transformation with professional interest. She watched as the sullen, defiant boy gradually became someone who took pride in doing his assigned tasks well and treating others with genuine respect. The change was so dramatic that she began incorporating Tommy's story into her educational seminars about the power of meaningful consequences. Professor Whitmore, the retired history teacher who had witnessed Tommy's initial punishment, returned to the castle later in the week specifically to see how the boy was progressing. He found Tommy carefully polishing a ceremonial sword while listening intently as Private Johnson explained the historical significance of each piece of military equipment. Remarkable, Professor Whitmore told Sergeant Hayes quietly. I've been teaching for 40 years and I've rarely seen such a complete transformation in such a short time. Whatever you've done with that boy, it's worked better than any classroom lesson I've ever taught. On the final day of his volunteer service, Tommy was allowed to participate in the changing of the guard ceremony in a small but meaningful way. He stood at attention alongside the guards, his posture perfect after a week of practice, his understanding deep after days of learning about the history and significance of every tradition he had once found amusing. The crowd that day included many of the same tourists who had witnessed his original act of defiance. Some recognized him and whispered among themselves about the dramatic change they were seeing. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of how people could learn and grow from their mistakes. When the ceremony concluded, Lord Hampton approached Tommy for a final conversation. "Young man," he said, "you've shown us something important this week. You've proven that respect can be learned, that character can be developed, and that mistakes don't have to define who we become." Tommy's grandmother, Mrs. Mitchell, had been informed about the entire situation on the first day and had supported Tommy's volunteer service throughout the week. She arrived at the castle on the final day with tears in her eyes, hardly recognizing the respectful, mature young man who had replaced the defiant troublemaker she had been struggling to manage all summer. "Tommy," she said, embracing him warmly, "I'm so proud of the choice you made to learn from this experience instead of just being angry about getting caught. You've become the kind of young man your parents hoped you would be when they sent you to stay with me." Sergeant Hayes gathered all the guards who had worked with Tommy throughout the week for a final ceremony. In front of the assembled group, he presented Tommy with a small pin bearing the royal insignia. "This pin," he explained, "is given only to those who have shown genuine respect for our traditions and genuine commitment to service. You've earned it through your actions this week, not through your words on that first day." Tommy accepted the pin with shaking hands, understanding that he was receiving something far more valuable than a simple piece of metal. He was being recognized as someone worthy of respect, someone who had learned to honor the values that made civilization possible. As Tommy prepared to leave the castle grounds for the final time, he turned back to look at Sergeant Hayes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I didn't deserve your patience. Thank you for teaching me what respect really means." Years later, Tommy would join the military himself, inspired by the lesson he learned that summer day when his act of defiance was transformed into an education in honor, duty, and service. He would tell the story of his encounter with Sergeant Hayes to other young soldiers, helping them understand that true strength comes not from mocking authority, but from earning the right to be trusted with responsibility. The impudent kid who had shown a royal guard his middle finger had learned the most important lesson of his life, that respect must be earned through our actions, and that the greatest honor comes from serving something greater than ourselves.